I was 16 the night my father locked the door and left me outside in the middle of winter, and the sound I remember most is not his voice or the wind, but the click of the deadbolt sliding into place, final and deliberate like a verdict being read. It was January in Maine, the kind of cold that feels personal, the kind that bites through denim and cotton and settles into your bones as if it plans to stay there. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, thick and steady, turning the street into a white blur under the yellow glow of the streetlights. I was wearing sneakers with holes in the soles, a thin hoodie, and nothing else. No coat, no gloves, no phone, no money. I had walked out the door expecting a conversation and stepped into exile instead. My father stood on the other side of the glass, his face tight, his jaw set in that way that meant he had already decided who I was going to be in his story. "If you are going to live like that," he said, his voice flat and tired, "do not come back." I remember opening my mouth to ask him what that even meant, what rumor he was talking about, who had told him these things about me, but the door was already closing. The lock turned. The porch light stayed on bright and accusing, illuminating me like evidence left behind. I stood there for a few seconds that felt like minutes, staring at my own reflection in the glass, my breath fogging up the door, my hands shaking so hard I had to clench them into fists. I kept thinking this had to be a mistake, that any second now the door would open again and he would tell me to come inside, that he would realize he had gone too far. It did not open. Behind him through the narrow window I could see my Aunt Marjorie hovering in the hallway. Her arms folded, her lips pressed together in something that looked like concern if you did not know how to read it. She did not say a word. Silence was her weapon, and she used it well. I knocked once softly, then harder, my knuckles already numb, my voice cracking as I called his name. The only answer was the wind rising, carrying loose snow across the porch in sharp, stinging waves. That was the moment it hit me, the real twist of the knife, the thing that hurt more than the cold ever could. He was not throwing me out because he knew the truth. He was throwing me out because he did not want to know it. Somewhere inside that warm house, my father had decided it was easier to trust a rumor than to look at his daughter and ask her a question. The story they told about me was convenient. It explained away his discomfort, his anger, his fear. It let him feel righteous instead of responsible. I stepped off the porch and onto the snow-covered walkway, my sneakers soaking through, almost immediately the cold seeping in fast and merciless. Each breath burned my throat. Each step felt heavier than the last. I could hear televisions through the walls of the neighboring houses, muffled laughter, the clink of dishes, ordinary life continuing just a few feet away while mine was being dismantled piece by piece. I did not knock on any of those doors. I knew better. In our town, people watched, but they did not interfere. They looked away when things got uncomfortable. They told themselves it was none of their business. I started walking because standing still was not an option. I had nowhere to go, but I knew that if I stopped moving, the cold would take over. Slow, my thoughts make lying down feel like a good idea. Snow crept into my shoes, melting against my skin, turning my socks into ice. My fingers went numb, then my toes, then parts of my legs I did not even know could go numb. I focused on small things to keep myself upright, the crunch of snow underfoot, the rhythm of my breathing, the memory of my mother brushing my hair when I was little and telling me that I was stronger than I thought. She had been gone for 5 years by then, and in that moment I missed her with a physical ache, a desperate wish that she were still alive because I knew she would not have believed this lie about me. Halfway down the block, I stopped and turned back, staring at the dark outline of my house, the place that was supposed to keep me safe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pound on the door until someone had to listen. Instead, I wrapped my arms around myself and kept walking because the truth was already settling in, heavier than the snow piling on my shoulders. Trust had turned into abandonment, and it had happened so quickly, so casually, that I barely had time to understand it. That night was not just about being locked out in the cold. It was about the moment my father chose comfort over truth, silence over responsibility, and a story that made him feel better over the daughter standing in front of him. I did not know it yet, but that choice would follow all of us for decades. I was 16, shaking in the dark, and my life as I knew it had just ended. I am 29 years old now, sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment in Portland, Maine, watching gray morning light slide across the harbor and thinking about how strange it is that winter still has the power to stop my breath. The radiator clicks and hisses beside me, steady and reliable, a sound I once took for granted and now notice every single time. Outside, fishing boats move slowly through the water, their engines low and patient, and everything looks calm, ordinary, safe. That is the life I built after that night, a life made of small certainties. A locked door that I control. Heat that does not disappear without warning. A phone on the table in front of me, fully charged, face down, silent, until it is not. When it rang this morning, I knew before I answered that it was not going to be a good call. Some part of me recognized the number, even though it had been more than a decade since anyone from that world had tried to reach me. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, carefully neutral. She introduced herself as a nurse from Mercy Hospital and asked if I was Eleanor Warren. When I said yes, she paused just long enough for the weight of the question to land and then asked if I was listed as the next of kin for Frank Warren, my father. I had not said his name out loud in years. Hearing it spoken so casually like a line item on a chart made my chest tighten. The nurse told me he had been admitted overnight after collapsing at home, that his condition was stable but serious, and that the hospital needed to know who to contact. I thanked her because that is what you do when you are raised to be polite, even in moments that hurt, and told her I would call back. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time without moving my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. It is strange what comes back to you in moments like that. Not the big dramatic memories, not the shouting or the door slamming, but the quiet details. The way my father used to clear his throat before saying something he thought was important. The smell of sawdust on his jacket when he came home from work. The way he never learned how to cook anything except scrambled eggs, and even those were always a little burnt. For years, I told myself I did not care anymore, that I had put that part of my life behind me, sealed it off, and moved on. Therapy taught me better words for what actually happened. You do not stop caring. You learn how to carry it without letting it crush you. I have done that work. I went to college later than most people. I built a career helping other families navigate systems that once failed me. I found a quiet kind of happiness that does not announce itself loudly, but shows up every day, steady and earned. And still, one phone call was enough to bring the past rushing back, sharp and vivid, like cold air filling my lungs. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my forehead lightly against the glass, grounding myself in the present. This apartment is mine. This life is mine. No one can lock me out of it. The nurse did not know any of that. She did not know the history behind the name on her screen, the choices that had been made the nights that followed, the years it took to feel whole again. To her, this was a simple administrative question. To me, it was an echo of the night everything changed. I thought about the last time I saw my father, the way his face looked when the truth finally caught up to him, and the silence that stretched between us afterward. I thought about how trust once broken, that completely does not magically repair itself just because time passes. I picked up my phone again and turned it over, watching the screen light up. Somewhere inside me, the 16-year-old girl who stood shaking in the snow was still listening, still wondering if this was another test, another moment where I would be asked to sacrifice myself for someone else's comfort. I took a slow breath and reminded myself of what I know now. I am not that girl anymore. I am an adult with choices, with boundaries, with the right to decide what I owe and what I do not. The past was knocking, but this time I was the one holding the keys. To understand why my father believed a rumor so easily, you have to understand the house I grew up in and the rules that were never written down but always enforced. My name is Eleanor Warren, but everyone called me Ellie back then, a softer name for a girl who learned early that softness was expected of her. My father, Frank Warren, was 63 now, but in his early 50s, when everything happened, a lifelong shipyard worker with rough hands, a bad back, and a belief system shaped by long hours, hard winters, and a very clear idea of what men and women were supposed to be. My mother, Susan, had been the balance in our home. She died when I was 11, sudden and unfair, a stroke that left the kitchen half cleaned and my science project unfinished on the table. After that, the house never found its footing again. My father did not hit us. He did not drink himself into oblivion. From the outside, we looked like a family that had simply suffered a loss and kept going. Inside, everything tilted. He retreated into silence and routine, into work and television and exhaustion, leaving emotional space that someone else was quick to occupy. That someone was my Aunt Marjorie, his younger sister, who lived only 2 streets away and had opinions about everything. She came over constantly after my mother died, bringing casseroles and unsolicited advice, commenting on my clothes, my grades, my posture, the way I spoke. She liked to say she was just trying to help, that someone had to step in now that Susan was gone. My father let her. He trusted her because she agreed with him, because she told him what he already believed. I was the oldest child, the daughter, the one who was supposed to understand, to adapt, to not make things harder. My younger brother Ryan was 14 when our mother died, all elbows and anger and grief he did not know what to do with. He punched walls. He skipped school. He got into fights. My father called it boys being boys and worried quietly about his future, about whether Ryan would grow into a strong man. When I cried, when I asked questions, when I pushed back even a little, it was different. I was told to be patient, to be mature, to help my brother, to help my father. I learned quickly that my emotions were inconvenient. The unspoken rule was simple. Ryan's pain was understandable. Mine was disruptive. That difference only grew as I got older. Ryan stayed out late and came home smelling like cigarettes and sweat, and my father lectured him once before letting it go. I came home 20 minutes late from my part-time job at the grocery store, and there were questions. Where had I been? Who was I with? Why had I not called? My Aunt Marjorie watched all of this with quiet satisfaction, reinforcing every double standard with a concerned look and a carefully chosen word. Girls have to protect their reputations, she would say. People talk. The world is not kind to girls who make bad choices. Bad choices in her mind meant anything that did not fit neatly into her idea of respectability. I was 16, trying to figure out who I was in a house that had already decided who I should be. I got good grades. I worked weekends. I stayed home more than I went out. None of that mattered because the story forming around me was more powerful than the truth. In that family system, men were defended and women were managed. Sons were investments. Daughters were liabilities. My father never said it out loud, but he lived it. He worried about Ryan's future in the abstract, about college and jobs and mistakes that could be forgiven. With me, the worry was moral. What would people think? What kind of woman would I become? Would I embarrass the family? My aunt fed that fear constantly, framing her interference as protection. She had lost her own husband years earlier and had no children, and I did not understand it then, but now I see how much power she took from shaping our lives. She became the voice my father listened to when he did not want to listen to himself. The house felt smaller every year, tighter, like the walls were closing in. Conversations happened around me, not with me. Decisions were made without my input and justified later as being for my own good. That phrase would come back to haunt me. For my own good. It was used to excuse control, to silence questions, to turn concern into something sharp and dangerous. By the time the rumor surfaced, the groundwork had already been laid. I was the girl who needed watching, the girl who might go wrong if not carefully managed, the girl whose word carried less weight than the comfort of the adults around her. When my father stood on that porch and locked me out, he was not just reacting to a single lie. He was acting out years of unchallenged beliefs about who deserved trust and who did not. In that moment, the family system did exactly what it had been designed to do. It sacrificed the daughter to preserve the illusion of order, and everyone involved told themselves it was necessary. What people imagine when they hear the words domestic violence is shouting bruises, broken furniture, police lights flashing in the driveway. What they do not picture is the quiet version, the kind that leaves no marks, and therefore no witnesses, the kind that teaches you to doubt yourself long before anyone else ever does. In our house, violence did not come with fists. It came with looks, with sighs, with long pauses that made you feel foolish for speaking at all. It came with rules that shifted without warning, and punishments that were framed as lessons. After my mother died, my father did not know how to be emotionally present, so he became morally strict instead. He did not ask how I was coping. He told me how I should behave. There was a right way to grieve and a wrong way, and I learned quickly that my way was always the wrong one. If I cried, I was told to be strong. If I went quiet, I was accused of sulking. If I tried to explain myself, I was talking back. There was no safe response, only the constant effort to choose the least damaging option. My Aunt Marjorie thrived in that environment. She never raised her voice. She did not have to. She mastered the art of the concerned suggestion, the well-timed comment dropped just as my father was already tired and irritated. "I worry about Ellie," she would say, her tone gentle. "She seems angry lately, or distant. Teen girls can get into trouble so easily." She never accused me directly. She let the implication do the work. My father absorbed it all, nodding, rubbing his temples already overwhelmed. The message was clear. I was a problem that needed managing. The control showed up in small ways at first. My clothes were inspected before school. My phone was checked without warning. If I locked my bedroom door to study, I was told I had something to hide. Ryan, meanwhile, was given privacy as a sign of trust. When he slammed doors or raised his voice, it was chalked up to hormones, to grief, to stress. When I did the same, it was evidence. Evidence of what no one ever fully said, but I could feel it building, a case file made of moments taken out of context. Silence was not neutral in that house. It was enforced. If I complained about how Ryan spoke to me, I was told not to provoke him. If I mentioned how unfair the rules felt, my father would look at me with disappointment and say, "I thought you were more mature than this." That sentence did more damage than any slap ever could. It taught me that asking for fairness was childish, that wanting to be heard was selfish, that love was conditional on how easy you made things for everyone else. Over time, I started censoring myself automatically. I measured every word before I spoke. I learned to read the room the way other kids learned algebra. I could tell by the way my father set his keys down whether it was a good night to talk or a night to disappear into my room. I could tell by my aunt's posture whether she had planted a new idea in his head. The house ran on unspoken power dynamics, and I was always on the lowest rung. This was the environment in which the rumor took root. By the time someone said out loud that they were worried about my behavior, about who I might be seeing, about what kind of girl I was becoming, it did not sound outrageous. It sounded plausible because plausibility had been carefully constructed. My father did not ask me directly if any of it was true. He asked me why people would say such things. The burden of proof was on me to disprove a story I did not even know the details of yet. That is how silent violence works. It shifts responsibility onto the victim and calls it concern. It uses fear as a substitute for facts and then punishes you for reacting to that fear. By the time winter came, by the time the air turned sharp and unforgiving, I was already isolated inside my own home. I had learned not to reach out. I had learned that explaining myself only made things worse. When my father finally decided to lock the door, he did not see it as cruelty. He saw it as discipline, as protection, as doing what had to be done. That is the most dangerous part of this kind of abuse. It convinces everyone involved that harm is not only justified but necessary. And once that belief takes hold, the line between care and punishment disappears completely. The rumor did not arrive in our house like a sudden explosion. It crept in quietly disguised as concern carried on familiar voices that had already earned my father's trust. I did not hear the first version of it directly. That is how these things usually work. It was discussed in my absence, shaped and reshaped until it sounded reasonable enough to repeat. By the time it reached me, it was no longer a question. It was a conclusion. My Aunt Marjorie was the one who introduced it, though she would never admit that. She framed everything as worry, as moral responsibility, as the burden of an adult who saw something dangerous forming and felt obligated to intervene. She had a way of lowering her voice when she spoke, leaning in slightly like she was sharing a secret she wished she did not have to tell. "Frank," she would say to my father, "I hate to even bring this up, but people are starting to talk." That sentence alone was enough to put him on edge. In our town, reputation mattered more than reality. People did not need proof. They needed whispers. According to Marjorie, a woman from church had seen me walking home with an older boy. A neighbor had mentioned that I was out too late on a school night. Someone else had heard that I was skipping class, that I was acting different, that I seemed troubled. Each detail was small, unverifiable, impossible to pin down, but together they formed a picture that fit too neatly into the fears my father already carried. No names were given, no dates, no concrete facts, just a growing sense that something was wrong with me. Marjorie never accused me of anything specific. She did not have to. She let my father's imagination do the rest. Teen girls get into trouble, she would say, especially after losing their mothers. They look for attention in the wrong places. I would hate for Ellie to ruin her life before it even starts. That was the genius of it. She positioned herself as my protector while quietly dismantling my credibility. The rumor took on a moral tone very quickly. This was not about behavior anymore. It was about values, about shame, about what kind of girl I was becoming. My father started watching me more closely, his eyes lingering a little too long when I came home, his questions sharper, less patient. Where were you? Who were you with? Why did you take so long? I answered honestly every time, not realizing that honesty had already been disqualified. Once suspicion settles in truth, sounds like excuse. The more I tried to explain, the more defensive I appeared. Marjorie noticed this and used it. See, she would say quietly, she gets so upset when asked simple questions. That is not normal. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, but I did not understand how far it had already moved. The rumor grew bolder as it passed through other mouths. It was no longer just about being seen with the wrong people. It became about morality, about self-respect, about rumors of pills and bad influences and poor choices. None of it was true, not even close. I went to school. I went to work. I came home. My life was small and careful, shaped by fear of doing something wrong, and yet somehow I was being described as reckless. The disconnect was dizzying. What hurt the most was not that people believed it. It was that no one came to me with concern. No one said, "Ellie, are you okay?" No one asked if any of this was true. The assumption was that I would lie, that I could not be trusted with my own story. Marjorie's silence in front of me was just as powerful as her words behind my back. She would look at me with a sad smile, squeeze my arm, tell me she was praying for me. In public, she was gentle and supportive. In private, she was shaping the narrative that would eventually be used to justify throwing me out into the cold. The rumor was not planted to protect me. It was planted to control me, to give my father permission to act without doubt, to turn his fear into righteousness. By the time winter arrived in full force, the story about me had solidified. I was no longer Ellie, the quiet girl who worked too much and asked for too little. I was a problem waiting to happen, a risk to the family, a source of shame. And when the moment came when my father finally decided that something had to be done, he did not see himself as a man abandoning his daughter. He saw himself as a man making a hard but necessary choice. That is what rumors do when they are fed by bias and silence. They become justification. They turn care into punishment and call it love. The rumor did not exist in a vacuum. It thrived because it fit perfectly into the rules my family already lived, by rules shaped by gender and expectation long before I was old enough to question them. In our house, my brother Ryan and I were measured by entirely different standards, and no one pretended otherwise. Ryan was allowed to fail loudly. He could break things, raise his voice, storm out of the house, and it was all chalked up to grief stress or the simple reality of being a teenage boy. My father worried about him, yes, but in a distant, hopeful way, as if every mistake was just a phase he would eventually grow out of. With me, there was no such grace. Every small deviation from perfection was treated as a warning sign, every emotion as evidence of instability. When Ryan came home late smelling like cigarettes, my father sighed and told him to be more careful next time. When I came home 20 minutes late from work because a customer would not stop talking and my manager asked me to stay, my father's face hardened. "You should have called," he said. "People start to wonder when girls are out too late." That word again. People. It was always people. An invisible jury whose opinions mattered more than my reality. My Aunt Marjorie leaned into this difference with quiet precision. She praised Ryan's potential while questioning my judgment. She talked about how hard it was to raise girls in this world, how easily they could be led astray, how one bad choice could follow them forever. She never mentioned that boys were just as capable of making bad decisions. That was not part of the story she wanted to tell. The bias showed up everywhere. Ryan's anger was seen as strength that needed direction. My frustration was seen as defiance that needed correction. Ryan skipped school, and my father blamed the system, the teachers, the lack of support. A rumor circulated that I had been seen with the wrong crowd, and suddenly the blame was entirely mine. What had I done to invite that attention? How had I allowed people to get the wrong idea? It did not matter that no one could name who had seen me or where. The fact that the rumor existed at all was enough. This is how gender bias works in families like mine. It does not announce itself as hatred. It calls itself protection. It claims to care about your future while quietly stripping you of your present. My father began imposing rules that only applied to me, curfews that changed without warning, restrictions on who I could talk to, where I could go, how I dressed. If I protested, I was told I did not understand how the world worked. If I stayed quiet, my silence was taken as confirmation that there was something to hide. There was no winning. Marjorie watched these changes with approval, occasionally suggesting another boundary, another rule, another way to keep me in line. She spoke the language of morality fluently. A good girl would not mind these rules, she said once loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. A good girl would be grateful for guidance. I remember standing there holding a dish towel in my hands, feeling something inside me crack. I was already doing everything right, and it still was not enough. The bias did not just affect how I was treated, it affected how my words were heard. When I tried to explain myself, my tone was scrutinized more than my content. If I spoke calmly, I was cold and unfeeling. If I showed emotion, I was hysterical. Ryan could shout and be forgiven. I could speak softly and still be condemned. The imbalance became impossible to ignore, but impossible to challenge. Any attempt to point it out was dismissed as jealousy or drama. "You are always comparing yourself to your brother," my father said once, shaking his head. "That is not healthy." What he did not see or refused to see was that the comparison had been built into the system from the beginning. By the time winter deepened and the nights grew longer, the narrative about me was complete. I was the risky one, the one who needed watching, the one whose choices could bring shame down on the family. Ryan, despite his very real and visible struggles, was still the boy with potential, the son whose mistakes could be forgiven. Gender bias had turned a rumor into a verdict, and everyone involved told themselves it was for the best. When the confrontation finally came, when my father decided that drastic action was necessary, it did not feel sudden to him. It felt earned, justified, logical. To me, it felt like the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly for years, a process that treated my gender not as a part of who I was, but as a reason to distrust me. The night everything finally broke apart did not begin with shouting or drama, which somehow made it worse. It started quietly, the way storms often do, with a heavy stillness in the air and a sense that something was waiting to fall. I came home from my shift at the grocery store just after dark, my hair damp from the snow that had started falling again, my hands aching from the cold. The house was unusually quiet. The television was off. The kitchen light was on too bright, casting sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. My father was sitting at the table, his back straight, his hands folded in front of him like he was bracing for impact. My Aunt Marjorie stood near the counter, arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. Ryan was nowhere in sight, already excused from whatever was about to happen. I remember thinking, in a detached way, that this alone told me everything I needed to know. My father did not ask how my day was. He did not tell me to sit down. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes scanning my face like he was searching for confirmation of something he had already decided was there. Then he said my name, Eleanor, in that formal tone he used when he wanted to sound authoritative, and told me we needed to talk. My stomach dropped. He began listing concerns, each one delivered slowly, deliberately, as if reading from a script that had been rehearsed. People had seen me out late. People were worried. There were rumors about the kind of choices I was making, the kind of influence I was under. He said this was coming from a place of love, that he was trying to protect me before I ruined my future. I tried to respond, to ask who these people were, what exactly they were claiming, but every time I opened my mouth, he held up a hand, silencing me. "Let me finish," he said. "You need to listen." Marjorie nodded behind him, her lips pressed together in that same familiar expression of concern, as if she were bearing a heavy burden on my behalf. When my father finally stopped talking, the room felt smaller, the walls closer. I told him none of it was true. I told him where I had been, who I spent my time with, how careful I was. I reminded him of my grades, my job, the fact that I came straight home every night. My voice shook, but I did not raise it. I wanted him to hear me. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply like a man exhausted by someone else's denial. "This is exactly what I am talking about," he said. "You always have an answer." Marjorie stepped in, then her voice soft, almost kind. "Frank," she said, "maybe she does not even realize what she is doing. Girls her age can get in over their heads without meaning to." The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. I felt heat rush to my face, anger and humiliation colliding in my chest. I asked her directly what she thought I had done. She did not answer. She looked at my father instead, letting him interpret her silence however he chose. That was when something shifted in him. I saw it happen. The last thread of uncertainty snapped, replaced by resolve. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and said he was done arguing. He said he would not have this behavior under his roof. He said he had a responsibility to protect Ryan, to protect the family. I asked him what behavior he was talking about, begged him to be specific, to give me something concrete to respond to. He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "If you cannot see what you are doing wrong," he said, then, "maybe some time away will make it clear." I did not understand at first. I thought he meant grounding me, sending me to my room, taking my phone. Then he walked past me toward the front door and pulled it open, letting a blast of icy air rush into the house. Snow swirled in, landing on the entryway rug, melting instantly. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Frank," Marjorie said quietly, as if offering him one last chance to reconsider. He did not look at her. He grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door and held it out to me, then stopped, his hand tightening around it. "No," he said, changing his mind. "You can get your things later. Right now, you need to leave." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the moment where he admitted this was a scare tactic, a threat meant to bring me into line. When it did not come, panic flooded through me. "It is freezing," I said. "You cannot be serious." He met my eyes, and for a second I thought I saw something like doubt there. Then it was gone. "If you are going to live like that," he said again, his voice hard, "do not come back." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. I took a step backward, shaking my head, telling him this was a mistake that he was listening to, lies that he was throwing away his daughter over rumors. That was when he reached past me and turned the deadbolt, locking it into place with that final, devastating click. The door closed. The house went quiet. And just like that, the conversation was over. I was no longer a daughter in his eyes. I was a problem he had removed. The cold hit me like a physical force the moment the door closed behind me, sharp and immediate, stealing the air from my lungs so fast I had to bend forward just to breathe. Snow spun sideways in the wind, stinging my cheeks and getting into my eyes, melting there and running down my face like tears I did not have the energy to cry. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, staring at the door, my hand hovering inches from the wood, as if my body had not yet accepted what had happened. I knocked once softly, then again harder, calling my father's name, my voice already hoarse, already small. There was no answer. The light inside the house stayed on steady and indifferent, and that was when the reality finally settled in. I was not being punished for an hour or a night. I was being removed. I stepped off the porch and onto the driveway, my sneakers sinking into the snow, icy water seeping in, immediately soaking my socks, wrapping my feet in cold that burned. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in winter when sound gets swallowed by snow and everything feels suspended. I could see the warm glow of other houses, curtains drawn, families inside, eating dinner, watching television, living lives that did not include a 16-year-old girl locked out in the dark. I did not knock on any of those doors. Shame kept me moving forward. pride did too. Some stubborn instinct told me that begging the neighbors would only confirm the story being told about me that I was reckless, dramatic, out of control. So I walked. At first, I did not have a plan. I just knew that standing still would make things worse. My breath came out in short, painful bursts, fogging the air in front of me. My hands were so cold they stopped hurting and went numb, which scared me more than the pain had. I shoved them under my arms, hunching my shoulders, trying to conserve what little warmth my body still had. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the snow was actively pulling me down. My thoughts started to scatter, jumping from one thing to another without warning. I thought about my mother, about the way she used to complain about winter, but still loved how quiet the world became after a snowfall. I thought about my brother Ryan, warm in his bed, probably unaware of what had just happened, and the unfairness of that almost knocked me off my feet. I told myself not to stop, not even for a second, because I had heard somewhere that sitting down in the cold could be dangerous, that once you stopped moving it was hard to start again. I focused on landmarks to keep myself going. The mailbox at the corner, the old oak tree near the church, the closed gas station with the flickering sign. Time stretched and warped. Minutes felt like hours. My legs began to shake, muscles trembling with exhaustion and cold. My shoes were soaked through now, every step sending a jolt of icy water against my toes. I tried to wiggle them to keep the blood flowing, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. A part of my mind detached, watching everything from far away, narrating my own movements as if that might keep me alert. You are walking. You are still upright. You are still alive. The wind picked up as I turned onto the main road, blowing snow into my face so hard I had to squint, my eyelashes crusting over with ice. I started to feel strangely calm, a dangerous kind of calm, the edges of my fear smoothing out into something almost peaceful. That scared me more than anything else. I knew enough to know that this was not good, that this was my body starting to shut things down, conserving energy in ways that did not care about my survival. I slapped my arms against my sides, stamped my feet, anything to keep sensation alive. I talked to myself out loud, my voice sounding thin and unreal in the open air. Do not stop, just keep going. You can rest later. Somewhere warm, if you make it. That word echoed in my head. If. I stumbled once, catching myself on a snowbank, my gloves non-existent, my bare hands sinking into freezing powder. The shock sent a jolt of pain through me, sharp enough to clear the fog in my head for a moment. I laughed, a short, broken sound that surprised me. The absurdity of it all hit me then. I was a good kid. I went to school. I went to work. I followed the rules, and here I was wandering through a winter night like I had done something unforgivable. The rumor that had pushed me out of my house followed me like a shadow, heavier than my soaked clothes, colder than the wind. Trust turned into abandonment so quickly it felt unreal. One decision, one lie allowed to grow unchecked, and suddenly I was outside looking in, fighting my own body just to stay conscious. The road stretched on endless and dark, and for the first time that night, a single clear thought cut through the chaos. If I survived this, I would never let anyone do this to me again. Not my father, not my family, not anyone. I did not know how I would survive or where I would end up or what this would cost me in the long run. All I knew was that I had to keep moving one step at a time through the cold, through the fear, through the moment where a rumor had been given more weight than my life. I do not remember the exact moment my legs gave out, only the sudden sensation of the world tilting sideways and the sharp sting of snow against my cheek as I hit the ground. 1 second I was walking, forcing my body forward through sheer will, and the next I was on my knees in the middle of the road, my hands buried in freezing slush, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I tried to stand. My body did not respond the way I expected it to. My legs felt disconnected, like they belonged to someone else, heavy and uncooperative. That was when fear finally broke through the numbness, hot and urgent. I realized with terrifying clarity that I could not just rest for a moment. If I stayed there, the cold would win. I dragged myself toward the shoulder of the road, away from the thin strip of asphalt, curling in on myself instinctively. trying to protect my core the way I had seen animals do in nature documentaries. Snow gathered on my hair, my shoulders, my back, each flake melting briefly before freezing again. The quiet was overwhelming. No cars passed, no voices, just the sound of wind and my own uneven breathing. My thoughts began to fragment, slipping in and out like a bad radio signal. I remember thinking about the porch light at my house, still on, illuminating nothing. I remember thinking that my father would be sitting inside, warm and dry, convincing himself that this was necessary, that this would teach me something. I wanted to be angry, but I did not have the energy. Anger takes heat. I was running out of that. Somewhere in the distance, I heard an engine faint at first, then closer. Headlights cut through the snowfall, bright and blinding, washing everything in harsh white light. I tried to lift my arm to signal, but it barely moved. The car slowed, tires crunching over packed snow, and then stopped. A door opened. Cold air rushed in, different from the wind, carrying the smell of exhaust and warmth. A voice called out sharp with concern, asking if I was okay. I tried to answer. What came out was a sound, not a word. The person moved quickly, then boots crunching toward me, a heavy coat filling my field of vision. Hands touched my shoulder, firm and steady, and for the first time since the door had locked behind me, someone treated me like I mattered. They wrapped something around me, a blanket rough but blessedly warm, and spoke again louder this time, telling me to stay awake, to keep my eyes open. I remember nodding, though I am not sure I actually did. The world narrowed to that voice, that presence cutting through the cold fog in my head. I heard the word police somewhere, heard someone saying they were calling it in, that a teenager should not be out here alone in this weather. That word teenager echoed in my mind. It felt important, like a line being drawn that could not be erased. When the police arrived, everything moved quickly. Red and blue lights flashed against the falling snow, surreal and unreal, turning the night into something out of a movie. Someone checked my pulse. Someone else asked my age, my name, where my parents were. I tried to answer, but my teeth were chattering so hard I could barely speak. They lifted me onto a stretcher, the cold metal biting through the thin fabric of my clothes, and loaded me into the back of an ambulance. The doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing out the wind, replacing it with warmth and light and the steady beep of a monitor. As the ambulance started moving, I felt my body begin to shake uncontrollably, violent tremors that rattled my bones. A paramedic told me I was hypothermic, that they were going to take care of me, that I was safe now. Safe. The word sounded strange, almost foreign. As we drove, I stared up at the ceiling of the ambulance, my vision blurring, my thoughts slipping again. I remember thinking dimly that this was not just about me anymore. Adults were involved now. Authority. Questions would be asked. Someone would want to know why a 16-year-old girl had been found alone on a winter road with no coat, no phone, and nowhere to go. For the first time that night, a small, flickering sense of relief mixed with the fear. Whatever happened next, this was no longer something my family could quietly explain away. The cold had pushed me to the edge, but it had also brought someone else into the story, someone who would not accept silence as an answer. I woke up under fluorescent lights with the smell of antiseptic in the air and a weight on my chest that made every breath feel deliberate, like something I had to remember how to do. For a moment, I did not know where I was or how I had gotten there. My body felt heavy and distant, wrapped in warmth that bordered on painful as sensation slowly crept back into my fingers and toes. A nurse noticed my eyes open and immediately moved closer. Her face calm, her voice steady as she told me I was in the emergency department and that I was going to be okay. Hypothermia, she said, early stages, but serious. You were very lucky. Lucky was not the word I would have chosen, but I nodded anyway because nodding was easier than thinking. As the fog in my head began to clear, I became aware of another presence in the room, someone sitting quietly in a chair near the bed, hands folded in her lap, watching me with an intensity that felt different from clinical concern. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back neatly and eyes that missed nothing. When I looked at her, she smiled gently, not the forced smile of someone trying to reassure you, but something softer, steadier. "You are awake," she said. "That is good." Her voice was warm, confident, the kind of voice that did not rush or fill silence, just to avoid it. She introduced herself as Helen Moore and told me she had been the one who found me by the side of the road and called for help. I tried to thank her, my throat tight, my voice barely audible. She waved it off. "You do not thank someone for doing what should have been done," she said. "You thank people for doing something kind." This was necessary. That sentence stuck with me, though I did not fully understand why at the time. Helen stayed while doctors came and went, checking my vitals, adjusting blankets, explaining what hypothermia does to the body. She did not interrupt. She did not insert herself, she observed. When we were finally alone again, she leaned forward slightly and asked me a simple question. "Why were you out there alone tonight?" There was no accusation in her tone, no assumption. Just a request for information. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, unsure where to begin. The story felt too big, too tangled, too unbelievable. People had already decided what kind of girl I was. What would she think if I told her the truth? Helen waited. She did not rush me. She did not fill the silence. Something about that made it easier to speak. So I told her. I told her about my father locking the door, about the rumor, about my aunt and the way concern had been used like a weapon, about standing on the porch in the cold listening to the lock turn. I told her about walking until my legs would not move anymore. The words came out unevenly at first, then faster, spilling over each other as if they had been waiting for permission. Helen listened without interrupting her expression, serious, her eyes sharp. When I finished, I felt exposed raw, like I had handed a stranger something fragile and irreplaceable. She did not look surprised. She nodded slowly, as if fitting pieces into a larger picture she already recognized. "I spent 35 years working in social services," she said quietly. "I have seen a lot of different kinds of harm. What happened to you did not start tonight." That was the moment everything shifted. Until then, the narrative had been that this was a single incident, an overreaction, a misunderstanding fueled by worry. Helen named it for what it was, a pattern. She explained that finding a minor alone in dangerous weather automatically triggered certain protocols that the hospital had already notified the police and Child Protective Services. There would be questions. There would be an investigation. She said this not to scare me, but to prepare me. "You did not do anything wrong," she said firmly. "Adults failed you." Those words landed harder than anything else that night. I had spent years assuming that if something went wrong, it must somehow be my fault. Hearing an adult say the opposite without hesitation felt like air rushing back into a room that had been sealed shut. Helen stayed until a social worker arrived, a younger woman with tired eyes and a clipboard who introduced herself and asked me many of the same questions. This time, I answered without fear. Helen's presence anchored me a quiet reminder that someone was paying attention. Before she left, she squeezed my hand gently and told me she would be available if anyone needed to talk to her about what she had seen. I did not know it then, but Helen Moore was the kind of witness my family could not dismiss or intimidate. She was not emotionally involved. She was not invested in preserving anyone's image. She had seen too much to be fooled by concern masquerading as care. That night in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and fear. The right person entered my story at exactly the right moment, and for the first time, the truth had an ally. My father arrived at the hospital just after midnight, his face tight with irritation rather than fear. His coat still dusted with snow, as if he had come out of obligation instead of concern. I remember noticing that detail first, how he brushed the snow off his sleeves in the hallway before stepping into my room, as if tidiness mattered more than the fact that his daughter was lying in a hospital bed with warming blankets wrapped around her. He did not rush to my side. He stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, surveying the scene like a man assessing damage to property he did not quite recognize as his own. A police officer was with him, and a social worker stood near the door, clipboard in hand. Authority changed the way he carried himself. His shoulders squared, his voice lowered. He became careful with his words. When the officer asked him to explain why I had been found alone in freezing weather with no coat or phone, my father did not hesitate. He had already prepared his answer. He said he was dealing with a difficult situation. He said he had reason to believe I was engaging in risky behavior. He said he had asked me to leave for my own good to give me time to think about my choices. He did not say he locked the door. He did not say he knew how cold it was. He did not say he believed a rumor over his daughter. He framed everything as concern, as discipline, as responsibility. I listened from the bed, my heart pounding, realizing in real time how easily the truth could be reshaped if no one pushed back. The social worker asked him what specific behaviors he was referring to. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and said people had been talking. He said he could not ignore the warnings. When she asked who these people were, he named my Aunt Marjorie. He said she had been worried about me for some time and had only spoken up because she cared. The officer's pen paused over his notebook. The room went quiet. I watched my father's face as he waited for approval, for understanding, for someone to validate his decision. Instead, the social worker asked him why he had not contacted the police or a counselor if he believed I was in danger, why he had not called my school, why he had not ensured I had a safe place to go. The questions were calm, professional, relentless. Each one stripped away another layer of his justification. He grew defensive, then his voice tightening. He said parents had the right to set boundaries. He said teenagers needed tough love. He said he could not have me influencing my son. That last part slipped out before he could stop it. I felt something inside me go cold. Influence. As if I were a contaminant, a risk to be contained. Helen Moore, who had been standing quietly near the wall, spoke up then. Her voice was steady, unyielding. This child was hypothermic, she said. She was found alone in dangerous conditions. Whatever your concerns were, sir, abandoning a minor is not discipline. It is neglect. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father looked at her like she had betrayed him, like she had crossed a line. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Not guilt, not remorse. Fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of losing control of the narrative. The officer explained that Child Protective Services would be opening an investigation, that my situation would be reviewed, that there would be follow-up. My father nodded stiffly. His jaw clenched, absorbing this new reality. When he finally looked at me, really looked at me, there was no apology in his eyes. There was frustration, confusion, a sense that things had gotten out of hand. This was not supposed to go this far. That was the unspoken message. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about him. He did not act out of cruelty for cruelty's sake. He acted out of comfort. He chose the explanation that made him feel justified, that allowed him to avoid hard questions and uncomfortable truths. He trusted the story that aligned with his fears and biases, and when that story put me in danger, he still clung to it because letting go would have meant admitting he was wrong. Trust, when it is used to avoid responsibility, becomes something else entirely. It becomes an excuse. And that night in a hospital room filled with professionals who were no longer willing to look away, my father's excuses finally met their limit. I did not go home with my father when the hospital released me the next morning, and the decision was made so quietly and efficiently that it felt unreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Child Protective Services had already stepped in their presence, firm but calm. And for the first time since my mother died, adults were talking about my safety instead of my reputation. My father argued, of course. He insisted there had been a misunderstanding, that emotions had run high, that family matters should stay inside the family. No one raised their voice. No one accused him outright. They simply explained that until the investigation was complete, it would not be appropriate for me to return to his house. I watched his face harden as he realized he was no longer in control. That was when my Aunt Claire arrived. She was my mother's older sister, someone I had seen only a handful of times over the years, usually at holidays, always kind but never deeply involved. She lived an hour away, worked part-time at the local library, and had a quiet, practical way about her that reminded me painfully of my mother. When she walked into my hospital room, her eyes took in everything at once. The IV, the blankets, the bruised skin around my wrists where the cold had bitten hardest. She did not ask me what I had done. She did not ask why this had happened. She simply said my name, sat down beside me, and took my hand. "You are coming home with me," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy. Claire spoke with the social worker in the hallway. her voice low but steady, asking practical questions, offering her home as a temporary placement while things were sorted out. She did not dramatize the situation or play the hero. She treated it like what it was, a problem that needed solving. My father protested, saying she did not understand our family, that she was overreacting. Claire looked at him with a level gaze and said something I will never forget. "I understand enough," she said. A child almost froze to death. "That is all I need to know." An hour later, I was bundled into the passenger seat of her old sedan, the heater blasting a thermos of tea pressed into my hands. As we drove away from the hospital, I watched the building recede in the rearview mirror, my father standing near the entrance, smaller than I had ever seen him. I did not feel victorious. I felt hollow and exhausted and strangely light, like something heavy had finally been set down. Claire's house was modest, a small cape with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with books. It smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. She showed me the guest room, freshly made, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "There are rules here," she said gently, standing in the doorway. "Dinner is at 6. We talk things through, and no one throws anyone out into the cold." That last part was said without emphasis, but it landed with quiet force. Living with Claire was an adjustment. There was no chaos, no shouting, no constant tension humming beneath the surface. Mornings were quiet. She drank her coffee, slowly read the paper, asked me how I slept. In the evenings, we ate together at a small kitchen table and talked about ordinary things. She asked about school, about my job, about what I liked to read. At first, I did not know how to answer. I had spent so long being defined by other people's fears that I had lost track of my own preferences. Claire did not push. She gave me space to remember who I was outside of crisis. Child Protective Services checked in regularly, asking questions, documenting my progress, making it clear that this was not just a temporary inconvenience for my father. It was a serious matter with serious implications. I learned then how powerful structure can be when it is used to protect instead of control. Claire did not try to replace my parents or fix everything at once. She provided stability, consistency, and something I had not realized I was missing until it was there: safety without conditions. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without jolting awake, heart racing, waiting for the next confrontation. The fear did not disappear overnight. It lingered in small ways, in the way I flinched when doors closed too hard, in the way I apologized automatically for taking up space. But slowly, in that quiet house, an hour away from everything I had known, I began to understand that family did not have to hurt to be real. Temporary salvation does not always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like a spare bedroom, a set dinner time, and an adult who believes you without asking you to prove your worth. The investigation did not announce itself with drama or confrontation, which was exactly what made it so unsettling for my father and my aunt. It arrived quietly, methodically, carried out by people who were trained to notice patterns rather than personalities. A CPS caseworker named Daniel Ortiz became a regular presence in my life, showing up at my Aunt Claire's house with a calm demeanor and a legal pad filled with questions that were anything but casual. He did not ask me how I felt about my family in vague terms. He asked for timelines, dates, names. He wanted to know when the rumors started, who first mentioned them, how they escalated, and what actions followed. At first, answering felt like reliving everything all over again, my stomach tightening as I tried to remember details I had learned to block out just to survive. Claire sat nearby during those early meetings, not speaking unless I asked her, to her presence steady and grounding. Daniel explained the process clearly, step by step, treating me like someone capable of understanding what was happening rather than a problem to be managed. He told me they would be speaking with my father, my Aunt Marjorie, my brother Ryan, my school counselors, and my employer. They would review attendance records, medical records, and any prior reports involving our household. The goal, he said, was not punishment for its own sake, but accountability and safety. That word, safety, mattered. It reframed everything. At school, the guidance counselor was pulled into the process, and for the first time, adults compared notes instead of relying on assumptions. My attendance record was spotless. My grades were consistent. Teachers described me as quiet, reliable, maybe a little withdrawn, but never disruptive or reckless. The narrative that had followed me at home did not exist on paper anywhere else. That discrepancy raised eyebrows. Daniel visited my workplace, a small grocery store where I stocked shelves and worked the register on weekends. My manager was surprised to be asked if there were concerns about my behavior. He laughed, then caught himself apologizing when he realized this was serious. "Ellie is one of our best kids," he said. "Always on time, always polite. She stays late when we need help." That statement went into a file recorded and dated, another piece of reality contradicting the story my family had been telling. Meanwhile, Daniel met with my father at the house I had been locked out of, the same house where the porch light still worked just fine and the heat had never gone out. My father was defensive cooperative in tone, but rigid in posture, repeating the same justifications he had offered at the hospital. He spoke about fear, about influence, about concern for Ryan. He spoke about me in abstract terms as a risk, a variable, a problem to be addressed. When Daniel asked him why he had not contacted authorities or mental health professionals if he truly believed I was in danger, my father had no good answer. He said he did not want to overreact. The irony of that statement was not lost on anyone. My Aunt Marjorie was interviewed separately, and this is where things began to unravel. She stuck to her script at first, expressing worry, insisting she only ever meant to help, framing herself as the responsible adult who had spoken up when no one else would. Daniel asked her to be specific. "Who told you these things? When? What exactly did you see?" Her answers grew vague, circular. She referred to conversations she could not quite remember and people she could not quite name. Daniel noted every inconsistency without comment. He had seen this before. Patterns emerge when stories are repeated under scrutiny. My brother Ryan was the wild card. He was younger, angry, confused, and unprepared for the seriousness of what was happening. When asked about the rumors, he shrugged at first, then admitted he had heard them from our aunt, that she had warned him about me, told him I was a bad influence. He said he had never actually seen me do anything wrong. That admission landed hard. It stripped away one of the last layers of justification my father had clung to. Over the following weeks, Daniel returned again and again, following threads, cross-checking statements, building a picture that was very different from the one that had justified locking me out into the snow. What emerged was not a troubled teenager spiraling out of control, but a family system that had weaponized fear and gender bias, allowing rumor to replace evidence and silence to stand in for truth. I learned then that investigations are not about catching people in lies in a single dramatic moment. They are about letting people talk until the truth becomes unavoidable. Each meeting left me drained, but also strangely steadier. For the first time, my life was being documented accurately. My words mattered. My experiences were being taken seriously. The system that had failed me at home was now working slowly and deliberately to see me clearly. That process did not erase what had happened, but it did something just as important. It made it impossible for anyone to pretend it had not happened at all. The question that hovered over everything, the one no one asked out loud at first, was why? Why would an adult push a story so far that it ended with a 16-year-old girl nearly freezing to death on a roadside? Concern alone did not explain it. Fear alone did not sustain it. As the investigation deepened, the answer began to surface piece by piece in ways that made my stomach twist. It started with paperwork. Daniel Ortiz asked my Aunt Claire one afternoon if she knew anything about my mother's estate. The question seemed unrelated at first, a strange detour in an already painful process, but Claire's expression changed immediately. She told him that when my mother died, there had been a small life insurance policy. Nothing extravagant, but enough to help with expenses and provide some security for her children. The policy had been left to my father as the surviving spouse with the understanding that it would be used for the family. Claire hesitated before adding that my Aunt Marjorie had helped manage some of the finances afterward, claiming my father was too overwhelmed to handle paperwork. That detail caught Daniel's attention. He requested copies of bank statements and insurance documents, and suddenly the rumor about me was no longer the only thing under scrutiny. What emerged was not a dramatic theft or a single illegal act, but something quieter and more insidious: control. After my mother died, my Aunt Marjorie had inserted herself into my father's financial life, offering help taking on tasks, positioning herself as indispensable. She handled bills. She explained forms. She decided what information my father needed to see and what could be simplified for him. Over time, she became the filter through which decisions passed. My father trusted her because she reduced his stress, because she took responsibility off his shoulders. In return, she gained influence. According to records, Daniel obtained a portion of my mother's insurance money had been earmarked for educational expenses for both children, a loose arrangement without formal trusts, relying on good faith and family cooperation. As long as I remained in the household, as long as I was a dependent, that money was part of a shared pool. But if I became a problem, if I were removed from the equation, priorities could shift. Claire admitted that Marjorie had once made an offhand comment about how resources should be focused on the child with the most potential. At the time, Claire had brushed it off as ignorance. Now it sounded like intent. Daniel also uncovered emails between Marjorie and a financial advisor, messages sent without my father copied, discussing long-term planning for Ryan. College savings, support, investments. My name did not appear in those conversations at all. I was invisible. Worse than that, I was an obstacle. As long as I was present, as long as I was seen as a child worth investing in, the narrative of focusing everything on Ryan did not fully hold. But if I could be reframed as a liability, a moral risk, someone unstable who needed to be removed for the good of the family, that shift became justifiable. The rumor was not just about control over my behavior. It was about control over resources and legacy. That realization hit me harder than the cold ever had. I had been reduced to a problem to be managed out of the picture, not because I was difficult, but because I did not fit the future my aunt wanted to build. Gender bias played directly into that plan. Ryan was the son, the investment, the continuation. I was the daughter who asked questions, who took up space, who complicated the story. Casting me as troubled served multiple purposes at once. It silenced me. It justified harsh action. And it cleared the path for decisions that no one wanted to examine too closely. When Daniel confronted my father with this information, the effect was immediate and devastating. My father insisted he had never thought about money that way, that he had only been concerned about values and safety. That may have been true in part, but he had allowed someone else to define those concerns for him. He had trusted Marjorie to guide him, to interpret events, to tell him what mattered. In doing so, he had surrendered his responsibility without realizing it. Daniel did not accuse him of intentional harm. He did not have to. He simply laid out the facts, the timeline, the way the rumor had escalated, alongside financial discussions that excluded me entirely. My father went quiet. The color drained from his face as he began to understand that the situation was larger and uglier than he had allowed himself to see. For Marjorie, the mask finally slipped. When asked directly why she had pushed the narrative about me so hard, she bristled, her concern giving way to resentment. She said someone had to think about the future. She said families had to make hard choices. She said not everyone could be saved from themselves. The language was cold, efficient, stripped of any pretense of care. In that moment, it became clear that the rumor had never been about protecting me from bad influences. It had been about protecting a plan. My removal was not an accident or an overreaction. It was a solution. Understanding that did not make the pain go away, but it did something else just as important. It stripped the lie of its power. I was not abandoned because I was unworthy of love or trust. I was abandoned because someone decided I was expendable. That distinction matters. It shifted the weight of blame off my shoulders and placed it squarely where it belonged. The night I was locked out into the snow was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was the predictable outcome of a system that valued control over care, comfort over truth, and one child's future over another child's life. Once motive entered the picture, the investigation changed tone. It was no longer just about what happened on a winter night, but about whether that night had been engineered by a series of choices that favored convenience over care. Daniel Ortiz returned with a thicker file and fewer pleasantries. He asked for phone records. He asked for dates when concerns were first raised and cross-checked them against bank statements and emails. The pattern tightened like a knot. The earliest mentions of my supposed behavior appeared in messages sent by my Aunt Marjorie during the same week she had scheduled meetings about reallocating educational funds. The timing was not subtle once you looked for it. When Daniel asked Marjorie why her concerns escalated so sharply without corroboration from school or medical professionals, she said she had trusted her instincts. When he asked why she had not suggested counseling or intervention, she said she did not want to embarrass the family. When he asked why she had urged immediate removal instead of supervision, she had no answer that held together. Each response contradicted the last. Meanwhile, evidence in my favor accumulated quietly and relentlessly. Attendance logs showed perfect consistency. Teacher statements confirmed stability. My employer provided time-stamped schedules that placed me at work during hours I had supposedly been seen elsewhere. Neighbors interviewed by Daniel reported nothing unusual, no late-night disturbances, no suspicious visitors. One neighbor even mentioned seeing my aunt's car parked outside our house for long stretches during the weeks leading up to my removal, something my father had not recalled. The story was flipping not because of emotion, but because of math. Facts added up. Lies did not. Daniel presented a summary to Child Protective Services that reframed the incident as a failure of guardianship compounded by manipulation. He wrote that the decision to lock me out was not supported by evidence, not mitigated by safety planning, and not proportional to the alleged concerns. He noted the presence of gendered assumptions in the decision-making, specifically the idea that I posed a moral risk while my brother's documented issues were excused as developmental. That sentence mattered. It named the bias that had been hiding in plain sight. When CPS met with my father again, the conversation was different. He was no longer allowed to speak in generalities. He was asked to account for choices. Why did you lock the door? Why did you not provide a coat? Why did you not call for help? Why did you rely on one source and ignore all others? The questions were not accusatory, but they were firm, and there were no safe answers left. He tried to say he believed I would go to a friend's house. He tried to say he thought the cold would scare me into coming back. Those statements landed badly. Assumptions do not substitute for care. Fear is not a plan. At the same time, Daniel documented Marjorie's financial communications and noted the absence of my name from future planning discussions. He did not need to prove criminal intent to establish harm. He needed to show that her influence had shaped decisions that placed me at risk. He did that thoroughly. When the preliminary findings were shared with all parties, the room went silent. My father stared at the table. My Aunt Marjorie stared straight ahead, jaw-tight, eyes hard. Claire squeezed my hand. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. The story that had followed me for months was being replaced by another one built on evidence instead of rumor. CPS recommended that I remain with Claire while a family court hearing was scheduled to determine guardianship and conditions. They also recommended mandatory parenting education for my father and restrictions on Marjorie's involvement in decision-making. The word neglect appeared again this time in writing. Seeing it on paper was strange, heavy, validating. That night back at Claire's house, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the documents Daniel had left with us. They were dry and procedural, but they told the truth. The truth did not erase what I had been through, but it did something powerful. It put an end to the lie. And once a lie is exposed, it cannot keep pretending to be concerned. Family court did not look the way it does on television. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shouted objections, no last-minute confessions. It was quieter than that, almost clinical, and somehow that made it more frightening. The room was small-paneled in dull wood with a seal on the wall behind the judge and rows of hard benches that creaked when people shifted their weight. I sat beside my Aunt Claire, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to keep my breathing steady. I was 17 by then, older than I had been on the night I was locked out, but still young enough to feel painfully small in a room where adults discussed my life as a series of decisions and consequences. My father sat on the other side with his attorney, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. My Aunt Marjorie sat 2 rows back alone, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. The judge entered, everyone stood, and the hearing began without ceremony. The purpose, the judge explained, was to determine guardianship and to assess whether my removal from the home constituted neglect under state law. The words were careful measured, stripped of emotion, but every sentence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Daniel Ortiz testified first, laying out the timeline in clear, methodical language. He described the reports, the interviews, the discrepancies between rumor and record. He spoke about the lack of safety planning, the failure to provide basic protection, and the role of unverified claims in shaping my father's actions. When he mentioned gender bias explicitly, I felt a ripple move through the room. It was rare to hear that word spoken so plainly in a legal setting, and it mattered that it was there. Claire testified next. She spoke simply without embellishment about my condition when she saw me in the hospital, about taking me into her home, about the changes she had observed in my health and stability since then. She did not attack my father. She did not speculate about Marjorie's intentions. She focused on facts, on what had been necessary to keep me safe. When it was my father's turn, he stood slowly, his movements stiff as if each step required effort. He repeated many of the same things he had said before about concern and fear and not knowing what else to do. But under oath, those explanations sounded thinner. The judge asked him directly if he had locked the door. He hesitated, then said yes. She asked if he knew the temperature that night. He said no. She asked if he had given me a coat money or a phone. He said no. Each answer was brief, undeniable, and devastating. When asked why he trusted Marjorie's account over school records and his own observations, he said he believed she was acting in the family's best interest. The judge nodded once, then asked if he had independently verified any of her claims. He had not. Marjorie was called last. She walked to the stand with her chin lifted, confidence still clinging to her like armor. She spoke about values, about discipline, about the dangers facing young women. She framed herself as a voice of reason in a chaotic situation. The prosecutor asked her about the financial emails Daniel had uncovered. She dismissed them as planning nothing more. When asked why my name was absent from those plans, she said it was because my future was uncertain at the time. That answer drew the judge's attention. Uncertain because of what she asked. Marjorie paused. The silence stretched. Finally, she said, because of my behavior. The judge asked for evidence of that behavior. There was none. The room felt very still then. After closing statements, the judge recessed briefly. When she returned, her decision was delivered calmly without flourish. She found that my father had engaged in neglect by expelling a minor from the home without ensuring safety based on unverified allegations. She ordered that guardianship remain with Claire until I reached adulthood with supervised contact only if recommended by CPS. She also ordered my father to complete parenting education and therapy and barred Marjorie from participating in decisions regarding my care. Her final words were directed at my father. "Concern does not excuse abandonment," she said. "Trust does not replace responsibility." Those sentences echoed in my mind long after we stood and the hearing ended. Outside the courtroom, my father tried to speak to me. Claire stepped between us without hesitation. "Now is not the time," she said quietly. I did not look back as we walked away. For the first time, the institution that had once felt distant and intimidating had done something profoundly simple. It had named what happened and assigned responsibility where it belonged. The ruling did not end the damage, but it changed the direction of everything that followed. Consequences began unfolding quietly in ways that did not make headlines or inspire speeches, but altered lives all the same. My father left the courthouse looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his certainty stripped away, replaced by a hollow confusion he did not know how to sit with. The house I had been locked out of did not suddenly become warmer or kinder. It became quieter. Neighbors noticed the CPS visits. Church friends asked careful questions. Invitations stopped coming. People did not accuse him openly, but distance itself became a verdict. He returned to an empty routine work and home, and silence forced to live with the knowledge that authority had stepped in where he had failed. Parenting classes began the following month. He attended because he was ordered to, not because he understood yet why he needed them. Therapy followed slow and uncomfortable, peeling back layers of avoidance and bias he had relied on for years. Whether he ever fully accepted responsibility was something I would not know for a long time. My Aunt Marjorie's fall was faster and sharper. The court's order barring her from involvement in my care was not public, but the financial scrutiny that followed did not stay private for long. My father, shaken and newly suspicious, began asking questions about accounts and decisions he had once waved away. Trust, once broken, does not mend easily. Arguments erupted between them loud enough for neighbors to hear. Within months, Marjorie's influence over the family finances evaporated. She did not apologize. She blamed everyone else. She said she had been misunderstood, undermined, punished for caring too much. But the room for her narrative was gone. People who had once nodded along began to step back. Control without consent does not survive exposure. Ryan was caught in the middle. He visited me at Claire's house once, awkward and uncomfortable, his eyes darting around like he expected to be judged. He did not know what to say at first. Eventually, he admitted he had believed the story about me because it was easier than questioning the adults he depended on. He said he was angry, confused, embarrassed. He said he did not know how to fix it. I told him he did not have to fix anything. He just had to stop lying to himself. That conversation did not heal our relationship, but it cracked the wall that had been built between us. For me, the fallout was quieter but deeper. I stayed with Claire through my final year of high school, commuting longer distances, rebuilding routines that did not revolve around fear. I learned what stability felt like in my body. My grades improved. My sleep improved. The constant knot in my stomach loosened. Therapy helped me name things I had never been allowed to say out loud. Emotional neglect, gender bias, conditional love. Words give shape to pain. Once named, it becomes possible to move through it instead of around it. CPS closed my case once I turned 18, noting improved safety and support. The file ended with a sentence that still lives with me. The child has demonstrated resilience when provided with appropriate care. It was a strange thing to see my life summarized so clinically, but it also felt like proof. Proof that the problem had never been my character. It had been my environment. Consequences do not always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like loss of access, loss of influence, loss of control. My father lost the unquestioned authority he once wielded. Marjorie lost the quiet power she had accumulated, and I gained something none of them had expected me to have: distance, space, the freedom to grow without being managed out of existence. Winter passed. Spring came. Life moved forward. The night I was locked out no longer defined every conversation, but it left a permanent mark on how everyone involved was seen, including me. The difference was that now that Mark was a reminder of what happens when silence breaks and accountability begins. Turning 18 did not magically erase what had happened, but it did shift something fundamental inside me. The day I became legally an adult, there was no celebration, no sudden sense of freedom bursting through the door. Instead, there was a quiet morning at Claire's kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming between my hands, and the understanding that my life was finally my responsibility in a way it had never been allowed to be before. That realization was both terrifying and empowering. I finished high school that spring with decent grades and a determination that surprised even me. Teachers who had once seen me as withdrawn began to notice a steadiness in me, a willingness to speak up to ask for help when I needed it. I applied to a small state college not because it was glamorous or impressive, but because it was realistic and within reach. When the acceptance letter arrived, Claire hugged me like I had just crossed an invisible finish line. In a way, I had. College was not an escape so much as a rebuilding ground. I worked part-time, took classes seriously, and learned how to exist without constantly scanning the room for danger. Therapy continued sometimes weekly, sometimes less often, but always honestly. I learned how deeply the night I was locked out had taught my body to expect abandonment, how even kindness could feel suspicious at first. Healing, I discovered, was not about forgetting. It was about teaching my nervous system that the present was not the past. My relationship with my father remained distant. We exchanged occasional careful messages, usually about logistics or updates required by the court order until it expired. He apologized once awkwardly in a way that felt more like an admission of failure than an expression of understanding. I accepted it without warmth or hostility. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a performance. It is a boundary. My Aunt Marjorie faded from my life entirely. I did not miss her. Ryan and I spoke sporadically, our conversations cautious but real. He grew up too shaped by his own reckoning with what had happened. I stopped carrying the responsibility for his feelings. That was his work to do. Years passed. I graduated. I moved to a city that did not know my history. I built a career slowly brick by brick, choosing stability over spectacle. I made friends who knew me only as I was, not as a story they had been told. I learned what it felt like to be believed by default. That alone changed everything. There were still nights when winter brought back memories, when the sound of wind against windows made my chest tighten. But those moments no longer controlled me. I had tools now. Language, support, choice. Claire remained a constant, her house still the place I returned to when I needed grounding. She never asked for credit, never framed herself as a savior. She simply stayed. That was the gift. Looking back, I understand that the most dangerous part of what happened to me was not the cold or the rumor or even the locked door. It was how easily concern had been used to justify harm, how trust had been mistaken for wisdom, how silence had protected the wrong people. What saved me was not luck alone. It was intervention, witnesses, records. Adults who understood that love without accountability is not love at all. I tell this story now not because it defines me, but because it explains me. It explains why I value evidence over assumption, safety over image, and boundaries over blind loyalty. It explains why I believe that family is not defined by who shares your blood, but by who refuses to let you freeze outside in the dark. My life today is quiet and ordinary in the best possible way. I wake up in a warm apartment. I go to work. I make dinner. I plan for the future without fear that it will be taken from me on a whim. Trust once broken can be rebuilt, but only when it is earned. And abandonment, no matter how it is dressed up, leaves a mark that demands honesty. The night I was locked out taught me that rumors can kill, that bias can masquerade as care, and that survival sometimes begins the moment you are forced out into the cold. But it also taught me this: some doors closing are not the end. They are the beginning of a life where you finally get to choose yourself. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that usually slips by without leaving a mark. I was 29, then settled into a routine that felt earned, living in a small apartment with creaky floors and too much light in the mornings. The envelope was plain, my name written carefully across the front, in handwriting I recognized immediately, though I had not seen it in years. My father's. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, letting the past and present collide in that thin rectangle of paper. I had not expected to hear from him again. Not really. Distance had become our agreement, an unspoken understanding that contact did more harm than good. But the return address was a nursing facility, and that detail alone shifted something in me. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I paid bills and drank coffee and planned weekends, and opened the envelope slowly. The letter was short and unpolished. He wrote that he had suffered a stroke, that he was no longer living on his own. That time had a way of clarifying things he had avoided for too long. He said he was sorry, not just for that night, but for believing a story that allowed him to stop seeing me as his daughter. He did not ask for forgiveness outright. He asked to see me, to speak if I was willing. I folded the letter and set it down, my coffee going cold beside it. For years, I had imagined what I might say to him if the chance ever came. I had imagined anger confrontation, a dramatic reckoning where everything would finally be acknowledged. What I felt instead was quieter, heavier. I thought about Claire, about the life I had built without him, about the peace I had earned. I thought about the winter night that had nearly ended everything and the years that had followed. Did I owe him anything? No. Did I owe myself something? Maybe. I decided to go not as an act of reconciliation, but as an act of closure. The nursing facility smelled like disinfectant and time. He looked smaller than I remembered, his body weakened, his confidence eroded by illness and age. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears, and for a moment the roles reversed. He was the fragile one. I listened as he spoke his words, halting his remorse imperfect but real. He said he had been afraid of losing control, afraid of facing his own grief, afraid of admitting he had been wrong. He said trusting the wrong person had cost him his daughter. I told him what I had come to say, that I forgave him, but forgiveness did not mean restoration, that I had built a life without him because I had to, that the consequences of his choices were his to carry, not mine. He nodded, accepting that boundary without argument. When I left, I did not feel relief or sorrow or triumph. I felt complete. Some stories do not need a happy ending to be finished. They need truth. Walking back into the sunlight, I realized something I had not understood before. Survival is not just about making it through the cold. It is about deciding what you carry forward and what you leave behind. That night years ago, a door had been locked against me. Years later, I chose which doors to open and which to close on my own terms. Justice did not arrive with applause or celebration. It settled into my life slowly, in small, almost unremarkable ways that only revealed their weight when I paused long enough to notice them. After visiting my father, I did not feel compelled to tell anyone what had happened. There was no need to narrate it, no urge to explain or justify my choice. That alone told me how far I had come. For years, I had been trapped in a cycle of defending myself against stories other people told about me. Now my life spoke for itself. I returned to work the next day, answered emails, went grocery shopping, cooked dinner. Ordinary tasks, yes, but they carried a quiet power. Nothing in my world depended on approval from people who had once held my safety in their hands and failed. That was justice. I understood then that justice is not always about punishment. It is about alignment. Things finally sat where they belonged. Responsibility rested with those who had caused harm. Agency rested with me. My father lived with his choices. My Aunt Marjorie lived with hers. I lived with the life I had built, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Occasionally, people would ask about my family, usually in casual ways, unaware of the history beneath the question. I learned how to answer honestly, without oversharing. We are not close, I would say, or I was raised by someone else when I needed it most. Both were true. Neither required explanation. The need to convince others of my reality had faded. That, too, was a form of healing. I thought often about the systems that had intervened when my family failed, about how easily things could have gone another way if one person had chosen silence instead of action. A neighbor who did not stop, a witness who did not speak, a caseworker who accepted a story without checking the facts. My survival had depended on adults who understood that care without accountability is dangerous. I carried that lesson into my own life, into my work, my friendships, my boundaries. I learned to ask questions when something did not sit right, to trust evidence over instinct when instinct was shaped by bias, to believe people who had something to lose by telling the truth. The winter night that once defined me became something else entirely. It became a reference point, not a wound. A reminder of how quickly trust can be weaponized, but also of how powerful truth becomes once it is documented, witnessed, and acted upon. I stopped seeing myself as the girl who had been locked out and started seeing myself as the woman who had survived because she refused to disappear quietly. The life I live now is not dramatic. It is not fueled by revenge or validation. It is built on consistency, safety, and choice. I pay my bills. I plan my future. I let people earn access to me instead of handing it over out of obligation. When winter comes, I still notice the cold more than most. I still remember the sound of a lock turning, but those memories no longer control me. They inform me. They remind me that love without protection is not love, that authority without accountability is dangerous, and that family is defined not by blood, but by who ensures you make it through the night. Quiet justice does not announce itself. It lives in the steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. Healing did not arrive all at once, and it did not look the way I once imagined it would. There was no moment where I woke up and realized the past no longer hurt. Instead, healing showed up in ordinary decisions repeated so often they slowly rewired the way I lived. It showed up in the way I chose my apartment, prioritizing light and warmth over status. It showed up in how I handled conflict, refusing to stay in conversations where my reality was questioned or minimized. It showed up in the fact that I no longer confused intensity with love or control with care. Those changes were quiet, almost invisible to anyone else, but they were profound to me. I noticed them in small moments, like when a coworker raised their voice in frustration and my body did not tense the way it used to, or when someone disagreed with me and I did not immediately assume I had done something wrong. These were victories no one applauded, but they mattered more than anything dramatic ever could. I kept going to therapy even when life felt stable, even when there was nothing urgent to unpack. I learned that healing is not about fixing what is broken, but about strengthening what was weakened, trusting my own perceptions, honoring discomfort instead of explaining it away, recognizing that walking away is sometimes the healthiest response. I built routines that made me feel grounded: morning walks, cooking real meals, calling Claire every Sunday evening not because I needed help, but because connection felt safe. Over time, the night I was locked out stopped replaying in my mind without warning. It became a memory I could visit, intentionally examine, and leave. I understood then that trauma does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes something you carry with awareness instead of something that carries you. I also began to notice how often people excuse harm when it comes from family. The phrases were familiar. They mean well. They did their best. Family is complicated. I stopped nodding along to those statements. I learned to respond with truth instead of politeness. Sometimes doing their best still causes damage. Sometimes intention does not outweigh impact. Those conversations were uncomfortable, but they were honest, and honesty felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. I did not become bitter as some people expect when you set boundaries. I became clearer. Clear about what I would tolerate. Clear about what I would never normalize again. I understood that protecting my peace was not selfish. It was necessary. The most surprising part of healing was how much space it created for joy. Real joy, not the fragile kind that depends on approval. I laughed more easily. I planned for the future without bracing for it to be taken away. I allowed myself to want things, to imagine a life that extended beyond survival. That was something I had not realized I was missing. Survival mode narrows your world. Safety expands it. Occasionally, memories would surface unexpectedly. A winter storm, a slammed door, a raised eyebrow that reminded me of my Aunt Marjorie's disapproval. When that happened, I practiced something I had learned in therapy. I reminded myself where I was. I named the present moment. I grounded myself in evidence. I am safe. I have choices. I am not a child being judged by rumors. Those words were not affirmations in the shallow sense. They were facts. And facts I had learned are powerful. Healing also changed how I saw strength. I no longer admired endurance for its own sake. I admired discernment, the ability to leave, the courage to tell the truth even when it disrupts a comfortable lie, the wisdom to know that loyalty should never require self-destruction. My life became proof of something I once desperately needed to hear. You do not have to earn safety by being perfect. You deserve it because you exist. The girl who walked through the snow believed she had to keep going or disappear. The woman I am now knows something different. Healing is not about proving how much you can survive. It is about building a life where survival is no longer the goal. Boundaries used to feel like punishment to me, something imposed by authority, something that took freedom away. It took years to understand that real boundaries do the opposite. They create freedom by defining where responsibility ends and choice begins. Learning that distinction changed how I related to everyone in my life, especially the people who expected unlimited access simply because of shared history. After the court ruling and the years that followed, my father occasionally tested the limits, reaching out during holidays, asking for updates, hinting at a closeness that no longer existed. Each message carried an unspoken expectation that time alone should erase consequences. I learned to respond without anger and without surrender. I would answer briefly, honestly, and only when it felt right. I did not explain my boundaries. I enforced them. That difference mattered. Explanations invite debate. Boundaries do not. When he asked why things could not go back to the way they were, I told him the truth, because the way things were almost killed me. The sentence landed between us like a closed door, firm and final. He did not argue. He did not apologize again. He went quiet. That silence was not abandonment this time. It was acceptance. With my brother Ryan, boundaries looked different. Our relationship was cautious but not closed. We spoke occasionally, sharing pieces of our adult lives without revisiting the past in detail. I did not take on the role of educator or redeemer. I let him arrive at his own understanding. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They determine what gets through and what does not. I stopped engaging with extended family members who tried to minimize what happened or rewrite it as a misunderstanding. I no longer attended gatherings where my presence required emotional labor or silence. The first few times I said no, my hands shook. I waited for retaliation, for guilt, for the familiar pressure to comply. It did not come. Or when it did, it was manageable. The fear had been larger than the consequence. That realization was liberating. Boundaries also reshaped my romantic relationships. I chose partners who respected no as a complete sentence, who did not push when I expressed discomfort, who valued communication over control. When red flags appeared, I did not rationalize them away. I trusted the evidence of my own experience. That trust was hard-won. It deserved protection. At work, boundaries showed up as clarity. I stopped overperforming to earn security. I stopped absorbing stress that was not mine to carry. I learned to say, "This is not acceptable," without apologizing. The irony was that my confidence increased not when I became more accommodating, but when I became more precise. People respect what you respect in yourself. The most important boundary I set was internal. I stopped interrogating my own memories for permission to feel hurt. I stopped asking whether it had really been that bad. I stopped comparing my trauma to others as a way to diminish it. What happened to me met a simple standard. It put my life at risk. That fact did not require context or debate. It required acknowledgement. Choosing boundaries did not make my life smaller. It made it quieter, steadier, more intentional. I filled that space with friendships that felt mutual, with work that aligned with my values, with routines that supported my nervous system instead of overwhelming it. I learned that peace is not passive. It is actively maintained. Every boundary was a decision to protect that peace. Sometimes people reacted badly. Sometimes they accused me of being cold or unforgiving. I accepted that misunderstanding as the cost of self-respect. Not everyone benefits when you stop being available for harm. That is not a flaw. It is information. Looking back, I understand that the night I was locked out forced a choice long before I was ready to make it: survive or disappear. Years later, boundaries allowed me to make a different choice. Live deliberately. Choose safety. Refuse narratives that require my silence. Boundaries did not erase the past. They ensured it would not repeat itself, and that more than anything felt like reclaiming my life on my own terms. For a long time, I believed the legacy of my family was something I had to escape, a shadow that followed me no matter how far I moved or how carefully I lived. Legacy felt like a sentence, not a choice. It was the accumulation of silence, favoritism, and fear passed quietly from one generation to the next, dressed up as tradition or concern. What I eventually learned was that legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you interrupt. The patterns that nearly destroyed me did not begin with my father or my Aunt Marjorie. They had histories of their own stories, shaped by loss, rigidity, and unexamined beliefs about authority and gender. Understanding that did not excuse what they did, but it did clarify something important. If I did nothing, those patterns would continue through me or around me, finding new forms. I decided they would stop with me. Rewriting that legacy did not require confrontation or public declarations. It required consistency. It required choosing differently every time an old reflex surfaced. When someone tried to use guilt to gain access to me, I declined. When a situation mirrored the imbalance I grew up with, I stepped away. When I saw someone being quietly undermined or dismissed, I spoke up even when my voice shook. Those moments felt small in isolation, but together they formed a new pattern, one rooted in accountability instead of avoidance. I began mentoring younger women at work, not in a formal way, but through presence and honesty. I shared what I had learned about documentation, about trusting facts, about recognizing when concern becomes control. I watched them absorb those lessons with a seriousness that told me how necessary they were. I did not tell my story often, but when I did, it was with intention, not as confession, but as context. This is why I value transparency. This is why I do not stay quiet when something feels wrong. The past became a resource instead of a wound. I also redefined what family meant to me. Claire was at the center of that definition, of course, but over time I built a chosen family that reflected the values I had fought for. Friends who showed up when they said they would. Partners who listened without trying to fix me. Colleagues who respected boundaries without testing them. None of these relationships required me to minimize myself to maintain peace. That alone felt revolutionary. I stopped chasing approval from people who were invested in misunderstanding me. I stopped explaining my choices to audiences that were never going to be satisfied. Legacy rewriting is not loud. It is deliberate. It shows up in who you trust, how you protect yourself, and what you refuse to normalize. Occasionally, I would hear updates about my family through distant channels. My father aged. Marjorie remained estranged. Ryan built a life that looked different from what had once been planned for him. I felt no need to intervene or correct the course. Their stories were no longer mine to manage. That, too, was part of rewriting the legacy, letting go of responsibility that was never yours. The winter that once symbolized loss now carried a different meaning. It marked the season when the truth surfaced, when intervention happened, when a story that could have ended quietly instead demanded accountability. I did not romanticize that night. I honored it as a turning point. A moment where survival was not enough and something better had to follow. The girl who walked through the snow believed she was alone because she had failed. The woman I became knows she was alone because others failed her. That distinction is everything. Legacy is rewritten not by pretending the past did not happen, but by refusing to let it define the future. I did not inherit silence. I inherited a lesson. Speak, document, protect, choose. That is the legacy I carry forward, and it is one I am proud to pass on, even if only through the way I live. The life I live now would have been unimaginable to the girl standing in the snow that night, shaking, terrified, convinced that being abandoned meant she must have done something to deserve it. Back then, survival was the only goal. Stay upright, keep moving, do not disappear. Everything else felt like a luxury meant for other people. Today, survival is no longer the measure of my days. Choice is. I choose where I live, who has access to me, what I tolerate, and what I walk away from without explanation. That may sound simple, but for someone who grew up believing love was conditional and safety could be revoked at any moment, it is nothing short of extraordinary. My life is not perfect, but it is mine. I wake up in a warm home. I go to work in a field I chose with people who judge me by my actions, not by rumors or projections. I have friendships that feel mutual instead of transactional. I laugh easily. I rest without guilt. These things once felt unattainable. Now they are ordinary, and I protect that ordinariness fiercely. When winter comes, I still notice it more than most. I notice the way the air changes, the way silence settles after a snowfall, the way cold can feel both beautiful and dangerous. But winter no longer owns me. It does not define my story. It reminds me of how far I have come and how much I refused to lose. Sometimes people ask how I turned out so strong after everything that happened. I do not love that question. Strength implies endurance for its own sake, as if pain were a test I passed. The truth is simpler and harder. I did not become strong by enduring. I became free by telling the truth and refusing to carry lies that were never mine. I became stable by choosing safety again and again, even when it felt unfamiliar. I became whole by understanding that loyalty should never require self-harm. The night I was locked out taught me what happens when trust is blind and authority goes unchecked. The years that followed taught me something better. That accountability matters. That evidence matters. That one person paying attention can change the outcome of a life. I think often about Helen, about Daniel, about Claire. About the adults who did not look away, who did not accept an easy story because it was convenient. Their actions did not just save me in the moment. They gave me a framework for living. Question what does not make sense. Document what matters. Believe people when they risk something by telling the truth. My father and I never rebuilt the relationship people expect when they hear stories like mine. There was no reunion, no restoration of what was lost, and that is okay. Some losses are permanent, and pretending otherwise only creates new harm. I offered forgiveness because it freed me, not because it erased the past. I offered boundaries because they protected my future. Both were choices. Neither required permission. As for my Aunt Marjorie, she remains a distant figure, a cautionary example of how control can masquerade as care and how easily harm hides behind good intentions. I do not wish her well or ill. I simply no longer center her in my life. Indifference, I learned, is sometimes the healthiest response. If there is one thing I want people to understand from my story, it is this: being abandoned does not mean you are disposable. Being doubted does not mean you are wrong. And being silenced does not mean the truth disappears. It waits. It waits for the right witness, the right moment, the right crack in the story where it can finally come through. The girl who walked through the snow believed she had lost everything. In reality, she lost what was never safe to begin with. In its place, she found something far more valuable: a life built on clarity instead of fear, on choice instead of compliance, on truth instead of rumor. This is not a story about revenge or triumph. It is a story about reclamation, about taking back ownership of your life when others decide they know what is best for you without ever asking who you are. I tell it now because someone else might be standing in the cold, wondering if they are the problem, wondering if survival is all they can hope for. It is not. You are allowed to want more than endurance. You are allowed to choose yourself. I did. And that choice changed everything.